Now let's try it. Well, that seems better. I don't hear the echo. Okay, so let's go to the first slide then. I'm assuming that everybody can hear me. I'm hoping they can hear me. So these are bad times for birds in North America. Actually, really bad times. A very important study came out at the end of 2019, probably the most important study on birds, North American avifauna ever. And it was published by about 20 of the best ornithologists in the country. And they not only gathered all the data they could find, but they analyzed the quality of the data so that they had confidence in the results. And basically what it says is that since in the last half century, in other words, since 1970, we've lost about 3 billion birds, or a third of our birds. And they've occurred across the line to birds in almost all lifestyles and habitats, with some exceptions, but some are hit worse than others, especially the sparrows, the warblers, the blackbirds. Some of the game birds are doing quite well, but the increases in the game birds is like 1/10 of the loss of other birds. So it's a very hard time. As a result of that, a third of the North American species are actually in danger of extinction if something doesn't change. I mean, it's not extinction that's going to happen overnight. It may happen over a decade or several decades, but they are heading towards extinction. And another half of the species on our continent are in danger of getting into that status of extinction. Only a small percentage of species are safe. As it stands right now, the bluebird is marginally, Eastern Bluebird is marginally in this blue zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some of the definitions and list some of the sources of data I'll use. I'll talk a little bit about the difficulty of assessing bird populations at a continental scale. It's much more difficult than one might think at first glance. And then examine the population status of the Eastern Bluebird, including both the distribution over its breeding range and the recent population trends. And then finally, we'll try to talk about some of the factors or influencers that might be controlling the fortunes of the Eastern Bluebird. So the definitions, the range, that's just where the bluebird is found. For example, in this little map, wherever it's pink, that's the range of the Eastern Bluebird. The distribution of the bluebird is how it's partitioned over its range. So you notice that it's much darker pink or magenta down here in the southeast because bluebirds are at a higher density down there, higher population rate. So that's the distribution, how the bird is distributed over its range. Population is just the total number of birds on the continent as estimated by our surveys. So that's an estimate. We never know exactly. And you'll hear me use the term abundance. Abundance is very similar to population, but on a smaller scale. I might talk about the abundance of bluebirds in some county in Illinois. Instead of talking about the population, I'm talking about the density of the birds in that county. So it's kind of, abundance is kind of population on a smaller scale. And finally, trend, this is very sensitive. Finally, trend is how that population is changing over time. Okay, so the sources of data, we have, in North America, we're lucky to have some excellent sources of continental data. I'm going to be talking mostly about the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is handled by the Biological Division of the U.S. Geological Survey. It is a scientific protocol. It's conducted by trained bird surveyors in the spring, and it measures breeding adults, numbers of breeding adults. There are other programs that are citizen science programs. Some of them are relatively new, like eBird, which some of you may be familiar with, which depend on people randomly calling in birds that they see all year, and across the whole world. There's the original citizen science program, which is the Audubon Christmas bird count, which has now become our best source of data for winter populations. And then there's Cornell Ornithology Nest Watch, which you know, and Audubon Climate Watch. All of these programs deal with bluebirds. So we're really lucky. We probably have more data on bluebirds than almost any other group of birds in North America. So let's talk a little bit about North American Breeding Bird Survey. It's actually 300, about 3,800 survey sites, and each site is actually a 25-mile route of rural roadway with 50 precisely located stops. So each route is surveyed during the breeding season in June. I have been surveying for the BBS, North American Bluebird Survey, for about 25 years. So it's a strict scientific protocol. I have to start 15 minutes before sunrise, which is 5:40, and I have to be done by 10:40, 5 hours later. This just shows the first 22 stops on my route across southern Ohio, southwestern Ohio, sorry. And we collect data, the bird counts. You collect for 3 minutes. You record all the birds you see or hear. You need to be able to recognize any bird call you hear, be able to recognize the species by the sound of the call. And then you record other factors like wind and weather and etc., weather conditions. That's all recorded in a central database, and that's how the estimate is made. Now here are the roughly 3,800 sites. Anything that says created in simple GIS is a map that I made. And I find it handy to make my own maps, because nothing wrong with the maps at these programs. They're much more sophisticated than my maps, but they don't always show what I want to show. So I have to be able to kind of make my own maps. And you can see there's quite a few BBS routes. There's like 80 some in Illinois. This is the route that I count right here in Ohio. And so of these 3,800 routes, each one of them has 50 stops that are surveyed each year. Here now are that was all of the routes. Now here are all the routes with the Eastern Bluebird. I'm only showing the routes that have Eastern Bluebirds in it now. And that's about 2,100 routes, or about approximately 38% of the routes, or 43 of the routes, and about 43 provinces, 43 or 69% of the states and provinces that are surveyed by the Breeding Bird Survey. So the Eastern Bluebird is a widely distributed bird, one of the most widely distributed. So now here I'm showing the same thing, only these are the sites that have Eastern Bluebirds, but now I made the circle larger. If the route only has a few bluebirds on it, it gets a tiny dot. If it has a lot of bluebirds on it, it gets a big dot, and you're starting to see a pattern. You can see these larger spots, these larger routes or higher density routes are occurring in the southeast, and the lesser density routes are occurring in the north. So there are more sophisticated ways to do that, though. Instead of just drawing dots, you can have the computer do something called kriging, or inverse weighting analysis, and you can estimate what the distribution from all those little dots. You can estimate what the actual distribution of the birds look like. So here's the range of the Eastern Bluebird and its distribution. And you can see in these darker areas, there might be 10 to 30 bluebirds on each route, in each 25-mile route. Whereas in some of these areas where it's light pink, you maybe have less than one bluebird per route. And that's because this is the heart of the range. And so we can also use this data to estimate total population. So we estimate that there are about 23 million bluebirds, or there were in 2015. That's the latest data that I have. Although we will be getting data for 2000 for some of the later years here in a few years, and then we'll have some updated data. And I have an idea about that data already, but I'm not free to talk about it because the program hasn't released it yet. But I will be putting something in Bluebird. I'm writing an article for Bluebird, which will appear in either the summer or the fall issue, which will have that later data in it. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so I've defined some bluebird regions. This is just something that I do myself, these little regions. I have 5 regions, a northern region, which is the Canadian provinces, a western region, which are these states out west of North Dakota and states west. And then there's the Midwest, which is us, and the southeastern states and the northeastern. The northern section contains about 4% of the bluebird population. The Midwest, we're pretty important. We have 19% of the bluebirds, or had as a result of as of 2015. The Northeast has about 9%. Probably a lot of people would have guessed that the Northeast has more than we do. But the Southeast is the heart of the bluebird, with 61% of the population in these 16 states, and the Western about 6%. Like I said, these are just my my convention that I've done. It's handy for my work, but I just thought you might find it interesting. So now, what about the trend? Well, how do you get the trend? Well, as I told you, well, I was going to say something too. I told you that there's about 2,000 routes that have Eastern Bluebirds on it, and each route has 50 stops. So each year, there are about 110,000 stops where people are surveying bluebirds. I say that to give you some idea how hard it is to survey birds on a continental scale. So the total number of bluebirds that are found in all those 110 stops each year are added together, and that's the estimate for the year. And that's these little dots you see here. This is the year, and this is the number of bluebirds they found that year. Well, it doesn't say 9,000 here, it says index. Don't worry about that. The Breeding Bird Survey deals with 500 bird species. They don't want to be putting numbers in here, so they have this index thing. The thing to keep in mind is the index goes up, that means the population is going up. So on the bluebirds, an index of 1 is something like 5,000 birds. So anyway, what it shows is from 1966, when the survey started, until the last data we have, which is 2015, we saw a solid positive trend of a gain of about 1.5 to 2% bluebirds per year. That's this green line. So this has the happy face. It looks really good. But in 2006 or 2007, we got to 2005 to, I'm sorry, in 2017, we got the 2005 to 2015 data. And at first I thought, okay, it looks good. And then I got to looking at it, and I could see it looks like it's flat here from 2005 to 2015. It looks like we're not growing anymore. In other words, this green line here looks nice, but it doesn't mean anything, because actually the bluebird population has not been increasing over this period of time, and that's shown by the trend. About 0.1% gain in population per year. That's not different from zero. So the bluebird population stopped growing, even though we're still working as hard as ever. And that was a big surprise. And you could say, why were we blindsided? And the answer is because we were blindsided. These are the results by decade for the Breeding Bird Survey. And so the first decade of the survey, we grew the population by 0.5%. Second decade, 1.5%, which is excellent. The third decade, in 85 to 95, we were increasing bluebirds by nearly 4% per year, which is just incredible. And then in 95 to 2005, when we got the data, we saw it drop down to 2%. Nobody worried about that because 2% is still a tremendous rate of growth. We just got this data all of a sudden. It was popped out in 2017. Bluebirds had stopped growing. We're still out there, but they had stopped growing. So here you can see it again, I think. Here are those changes by decade that I showed you. Small increase, a big increase to over nearly 4%, and then a drop down to 2%, and then drop down to nothing. And so here's the yearly results. And you can see this flat area here. So the question is, what's going to happen out here? And about 2027, we'll get the data for 2016 to 2025. And I can tell you right now, it's not looking like we would like. It's not increasing. It is showing, it's showing continued not good results. And we're going to have to see what we can, I'm going to present at the end of the slide some ideas, I think, about maybe what's going on. I don't know if I have a whole lot of ideas on what we can do about it, but I think it'll become clear what's going on as some of the slides near the end of the talk are presented. So the first question we can ask is, okay, so bluebirds we seem to lose our ability to increase the population about the year, around the 2000 time frame. Things flattened out. It was growing fine, and then things flattened out. Well, since the US, so is it this way all over the continent? And the answer is, if we just compare US and Canada, the answer is no. The US has bluebirds in 39 states, and they have 95% of the bluebirds. The average route in the United States has about 4.5 bluebirds. So you survey that 25-mile route, you're going to average 4.5 bluebirds that you either see or hear. But in the United States, so the United States looks exactly like the continent. We have not grown the bluebirds in the United States as a whole over this period from around 2000 to 2015 when the data ends here. And that's not true in Canada. Canada only has bluebirds in 6 provinces. They only have 4 or 5% of the bluebirds, and the abundance is very low. There's only a tenth of a bluebird, say, on every route there. But they have continued to grow bluebirds at a rate of 4% per year, which is remarkable. The problem is, this is just reversed. When you have such a small base and you grow it by 4%, that's fine. We're happy to have these bluebirds, but it doesn't add much to the population. Here's where we need to be growing in the area where the bluebirds are. So let's drop down to a lower. Let's look at state levels. Now, Tennessee is one of the most historically highest population of has historically one of the highest populations of bluebirds. And so here's the trends for 66 to 2005 in Tennessee. And we see the same thing we're seeing nationally. We see this rise, a good rise, until we get here to about around 2000, and then things are dropping off. We're losing 3% per year. What does that mean? That means that each year when those surveyors come back in June, they're seeing 3% fewer bluebirds than they saw the previous year on average. See, it isn't exact, but that's the trend. Some years are up and some years are down. So here's a state with nearly 14 bluebirds per route on an average route, and they're losing bluebirds at 3% per year across the state. If you cross the border here to North Carolina, it's different. North Carolina has 10 bluebirds per route on average, but they have continued to grow bluebirds through the entire time, and they're still increasing their population by 2%, whereas right across the borderline in Tennessee, they're losing. So there may be some clues there about what's going on, and I'm gonna give you some thoughts on that later in the talk. Same thing with Kentucky. Kentucky is one of the other key bluebird states. 14.4 bluebirds per route on average in Kentucky. You go that 25 miles, you're going to see 14 bluebirds on average. They're dropping at 10% per year, if you can imagine. And here's Missouri. Missouri has more bluebirds per 25-mile route than any state in the Union. They're 15, and they're dropping at 3% per year. So these are important states, and they're losing bluebirds. So what about Illinois? Well, I wish I had better news for you. Illinois has a lower abundance of bluebirds because you're farther up in the Midwest. You wouldn't expect to have 14 or 15. You have about 2.5 bluebirds or 2.6 bluebirds per state. But in the last period of the survey, 2005 to 2015, Illinois has been losing 10%. Indiana is losing 5% next door. We're not doing much better, but here's something else. This is data that was sent to me by Janice. This is the data for your society. And the blue bars, this is 1 decade, 2002 to 2022. The blue bars are the number of bluebirds you fledged, and the brown bars are the number of nest boxes that are in the survey, and the red line is the number of bluebirds per box on average. And this line here says that has not really changed much. It looks like it's dropping off here a little bit, but the statistics say it hasn't changed much. It might be dropping a little. But for the most part, I would say your losses here, your decline in the number of bluebirds that you're seeing each year seems mostly related to the fact that you have fewer boxes in the survey, not that there's something intrinsically wrong. So that might suggest that for people that are doing it right and monitoring bluebirds the way we know they should be done, monitoring the trail and taking care of their trail, they can offset some of those effects that are happening continent-wide. And that's just a thought that it carries no weight. It's just a random thought that I have, but it's something that occurred to me. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about bluebirders near the end of the talk, when we start talking about reasons. Okay, so that's you guys right there. So, and I was going to move the slides. Ohio, we're not doing any better. We're flat. We haven't been losing. We have about 4.5 bluebirds per route in Ohio, but we're not gaining at all. And Michigan is losing also. They have about 1.8. bluebirds per route. So the whole Midwest, every Midwestern state I've showed you has not been impressive, right? So I can't show you these for all the states, all 32 states that have bluebirds. So I'm going to show you this horrible graph, which I apologize for, but really I tried about 15 different ways to show this. This is the best I could come up with. So what you have here is a graph with about well, I'm blocking now. I think it's like all the states and provinces that have bluebirds. I think there's some 40 of them on here. This is Missouri, Kentucky. This is every state and province that has bluebirds, arranged from those that have the most to those that have the least. Okay, so here's Missouri, and the blue bars are the number of bluebirds seen on a route in that state. So here's Missouri. These blue bars are always positive because it's, it can't be negative birds that you see. So bluebirds, in Missouri, you see 15 bluebirds per route. Kentucky, 14. Tennessee, 14. Oklahoma, 10. North Carolina, 10. And go on down the line till you get way out here at the edge of the range in Wyoming, Colorado, New Brunswick, Quebec, North Dakota, where you see much less than one bluebird per route. And the red bars are the trend in that state, in that province. And that can be either negative or positive. Well, here's the first bad sign. The three states that have the most bluebirds, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, are all losing bluebirds right now. Here's Illinois, a state with a lot of bluebirds. We're losing bluebirds. Sorry, that's Indiana. Here's Illinois. Same with a number of these other states. And out here at the other end, the states that don't have any bluebirds, they're all showing big increases. That's kind of what I showed you before. These increases in Canada and North Dakota, where there are very few bluebirds, but the population is increasing. That's not what you want. I'm sorry. This is such a sensitive mouse here. I can't always control it. So this is a horrible way to look at data. Let me put this on a map for you. And this shows the advantage of being able to draw your own maps. Okay, so here's my map. What I have done here now is taken each state and put the average number of bluebirds per route in that state, color-coded it. So if the state is coded dark green, that means it has 5 to 15 bluebirds per route. All these states have 5 to 15. These states have 2.5 to 5, the next color green. And you go up to the yellow, which is 0.1 to 1, and red is less than a tenth of a bluebird per route on average. Well, this is a range map, and that's got a smiley face here because that's what a range map looks like. This is the heart of the range. There's a higher density. As you get near the edge of the range, the density drops. This looks perfectly fine, and no one would worry about this slide. This is how a range map should look like. But let me show you the next slide. And the next slide is the same slide, but here I've drawn a circle around this 12, I think, states here in the Midwest. And the reason I drew it around this because these states have 22% of the Eastern Bluebird population. Remember, these states down here, some of them are in that same circle. They have 62%. These states have 22% of the bluebirds. So look at the next slide. Now here, I've color-coded it a different way. This is the trend in the state, what the population is doing. So if the state is dark green, it means the population is growing from 3 to 10% per year. If the state is the next color green, it's growing from 2.5 to 3% per year. If the state is the lightest color green, it's still growing 1 to 2.5%. I've called them best, better, good. If it's yellow, I kind of consider it a holding pattern. It's either not growing or it's slightly losing. And if it's red, it's definitely losing. So what do you see? Here are these states that I said hold 22% of the bluebirds. Look at that. Every single one of them except Iowa, and that's the lowest level of green, is either losing bluebirds or holding their own. So there's your answer, I believe, as to why we're seeing what we're seeing, why bluebird populations are no longer growing, because the heart of our range, some of the states which are our best producers, have gone from producers to being states that are losing, bleeding out their population. And so the question is then becomes why? So that's the first part of my talk. And I wish it was a happier talk, but I'm just trying to give you the data as it is. So, and this data is is more or less backed up by eBird and CBC data. All of these three databases show very similar type trends. So at the continental level, the bluebird population at right now, it seems stable, but it's probably not been growing for the last 2 decades. And the breeding stock, as measured each June in the Breeding Bird Survey, in some of its most important states in the U.S. Midwest and some of the southeastern states like Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, appears to be declining. The breeding stock is declining there. In contrast, the breeding stock appears to be increasing on the edges of the range in the northern, western, and southern extremes. So, at least since 2000, bluebirds are not responding as well to our efforts. I'm so sorry about that. It keeps doing it. So it seems like at this point in time, we've kind of reached an Alice in Wonderland moment. If you've read, ever forced to read Through the Looking Glass, you know that there's a scene in there where Alice is complaining about it's hard to get anywhere, and the Red Queen says, yeah, here you have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place. If you want to go anyplace, you have to run twice as fast. That seems to be something analogous to what we're seeing for our bluebirds right now. So now this is the second half of the talk. What are some reasons for this observation that we're seeing in population trends? What are some things that could be going wrong? Well, things that could be affecting us are climate and pattern changes, sudden prolonged periods of cold, heat, drought, and food supply issues, lack of insects, habitat losses and declines, changes in numbers of nest box predators and nest box competitors. I think you can see some of these are much less likely than others. How about this one? Declines in the number of bluebirders and nest boxes that are being offered across the country, and increased numbers of uninformed bluebirders who go online and say, all you have to do is put up a box. And then they call NABS a few weeks later and say, my cat just killed the male. Okay. So how much is that affecting things? Because that's a lost cycle right there. And then epizootics, invert press. Those are things that could be happening. I'm not going to consider all of them. I'm going to consider them in order, and I've ranked them kind of how I worry about them. And I may be totally wrong on that. I don't know what, okay. So climate, you hear climate. What's the difference between climate and weather? Well, I think my definition is that climate is the weather over 20 years, for example, average over 20 years, something like, I think most people will accept something like that. There's all kinds of reasons being advanced as to why the climate is changing. There are scientists out there who are legitimate hardcore atmospheric scientists who don't agree with the main theme that's being advanced, that it's CO2 and other things. But, be that as the case may, we do all kind of feel, I think, that the days have been getting warmer, and I'll show you about that a little bit more. And this is the average, temperature in Earth. This is the entire world. This is the surface temperatures, the red bars, and the green are the two satellite systems showing, similar trends. So I think where that's expressed is in, the ambient temperature that's around you. And so here are a chart made by NOAA, and this is only in the United States. I tried to find one of these for the North America and failed, and I forgot to go back and look again. So, but here you can see, this is the temperature change. They're comparing two periods, this 6 decades with this decade. Well, first of all, I have a problem with comparing 6 decades with one, but be that as it may, let's just agree to overlook that and say that, yes, it does. From here, you can see that there has been a temperature change of 2 degrees, especially in the north and western parts of the United States, not so much in the central and southeastern and eastern parts of the United States. But there has been this increase for the whole year, over the year. Now, when you take the winter months, and obviously warm temperatures do have a negative effect. For example, here's a study that was done, and this is just a little plug for Cornell Nest Watch, why we should get our data in for them. In 2006, they did a study. They looked at the hatching success of 32,500 eggs. from 7,000 boxes and 500 sites. These are the sites. You know, we could never do that on our own. That's why if we get the data into Nestbox, they got the data, they can do these scientific studies on our bluebirding data. And that's so important. So what they showed is that as you go to the smaller latitudes, as you go south, the temperature is obviously warming, the average temperature, and the average probability of an egg nest failure in the nest, of one egg failing, goes up about fourfold as you go south. So that's just one effect. Of course, that's been going on forever. I'm not proposing that has anything to do with the effect that we're seeing right now. I'm just showing that, you know, warming does have an effect, and I'm putting in a plug for NestWatch here, Cornell. But if we look at the winter temperatures, they're even more exaggerated than the yearly temperatures. It's the winters that have been warming up most dramatically. And so this shows the trend, the change in temperature over 120 years from 1895 to 2017. And so this dark color is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and this blue would be the loss of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, it's the same pattern. It's the northern states and the western states that are mostly affected. The southeastern states are less affected, but the northern areas are being mostly affected. I think this is starting to look like something that could be one of the problems that we're facing with bluebirds, because there's no doubt that we're seeing bluebirds remain in more northerly latitudes. Remember that data showing the increases in Canada and North Dakota and those areas? Those are the parts where the bluebird trend is growing, the breeding trend. And some of our states that we depend on to raise bluebirds, like Kentucky and Missouri, and Kentucky and Arkansas, Missouri and Tennessee, states like that, are losing bluebirds. So well, I'm going to develop this a little bit more. I'm not going to just let it drop here. So I think the warmer temperatures probably in the winter encourage bluebirds to stay farther north, and that sets them up to be more prone to being destroyed or killed by these polar vortex disruptions. The weather people call it polar vortex events or something like that. The real name for it is polar vortex disruptions. I'm going to go into that in the next slide just a little bit, because I think it's interesting to know about. And they are becoming more frequent. I think there's been one kind of a polar vortex disruption or another the last 4 years. The one in 2019 was really a bad one. The ones since haven't been as bad, but there have been polar vortex disruptions. What is a polar vortex disruption? Well, first of all, what's a polar vortex? The polar vortex is just a jet stream that's about, in the stratosphere, it's about 10 to 30 miles above the Earth. And it circles counterclockwise, and it holds that icy temperature above the North Pole in place and doesn't allow it to drop down here into the jet stream. This is the jet stream that we talk about when the weatherman's talking. It's down here about 10 miles below in the troposphere where we are, and that's what makes our weather. Well, as long as the polar vortex is stable and in place, that cold weather doesn't get down into this jet stream and blow it over us. But when we have warm weather, excessively warm weather in the winter, it starts pushing warm air up. And when the warm air comes up, because warm air rises, the warm air comes up and can disrupt the polar vortex. It breaks down, and then that cold air in the polar vortex immediately starts dropping down like a stone, really, seriously, and gets caught in the weather jet stream, and then blows that weather across us. And they have, folks, we're having another polar vortex, the weatherman says. Well, it's a polar vortex disruption, but that's what's going on. And so you get these events. You see these, this is a satellite image, you see the streaks of clouds being blown at high velocity clear down into Texas across the middle of the country. And you see wind chill temperatures of -80 in the northern US and -40 in the central states and -30 as far as Kentucky. Here you see, this is -40 getting down here to Iowa, minus 30 down here into Tennessee and Missouri, states like that, and minus 10 in Texas, and etc. And we all know about these. But after that one in 2019, in January and February, NAB's got reports of hundreds of dead bluebirds found in roost boxes across much of the bluebird range. Well, obviously, I mean, it was a devastating event. Since then, there have been smaller polar vortexes in subsequent years. That's not doing bluebird population any good. And if you think about it, these surveyors are coming through in June and they're seeing fewer bluebirds. Well, maybe the reason they're seeing bluebirds is because 2 months before, a polar vortex weather event came through and killed all the bluebirds. It kind of fits. So I do think this is one of the problems that we're having. I'm not saying that there's a solution to it. Then again, when somebody said many decades ago, gee, we can save bluebirds if we put up nest boxes, somebody probably said, there's no way you can put up enough nest boxes to help bluebirds. It's a big continent. So I'm saying that you can do things that you don't know you can do sometimes. Maybe we can do something about developing widespread shelters for bluebirds. I'm just talking totally blue sky here, but it's just something to think about. And it's something that we hope that I've been talking with some people about developing an idea. So let's leave the climate now and to say that I think climate is something that we're dealing with, this cold weather, these vortexes. Another factor is insects. Of course, bluebirds are insectivores. They need insects. So we need a supply of insects, especially during the nesting season. Well, over the last decade, especially starting around 2005, 2007 to around 2017-18, there have been just a number of studies talking about widespread collapses of insect population. And the term insect apocalypse got thrown around. So if true, it would have massive implications for bluebirds. And here's some of the data like they were seeing. This is two graphs from a place in a nature reserve in West Germany. They measure ground and flying insects every year, and they compared the ground insects they found in 1989 with those they found in 2013. And say, just take July. In July of 2019, they found nearly a kilogram of ground insects in their traps. When they came back in 2013, it was only 150 milligrams. Huge drop. Same thing with the flying insects. They decreased over those decades. So there are many other studies like this, exactly like this, that show precipitous drops in insects. And I think some of that is happening. For a long time, we have been focusing on what we call charismatic insect species, and that's probably misleading. For example, we've been focusing on the declines of butterflies, like monarch butterflies. We're putting in milkweed and doing things for fireflies. But since these crashes have been becoming more popular, entomologists have been saying, hey folks, it's not only these charismatic species, but generally all insect species are crashing. And here's an example of one study in this study that from 2014. This shows some of the major families of insects, the Colenoptera, the beetles, Hymenoptera, the bees and the ants, the Lepidopterans, the butterflies, the moths, and the Odonata, the dragonflies and damselflies, and then the Orthopterans, the grasshoppers. And you can see that while, say, like 30% of the Lepidopteran species are decreasing, compare that with the Orthopterans, the grasshoppers, almost all of the species of grasshoppers are decreasing. 60% of the beetle species are decreasing, 50% of the ants and bees. So yes, we do need to be concerned about Lepidopterans, butterflies, because as we know, butterfly larvae are a big source of food for bluebirds, but other insects are crashing worse, I guess. So it's not, there's more to it than meets the eye by far. And really, here's an observation that I thought you might find interesting. 41% worldwide of insect species have been declining over the last decade. And compare that with vertebrates, only 22% of vertebrate species are increasing. So actually invertebrates or insects are doing worse than vertebrates. If somebody would have just walked up to me and told me that, I wouldn't have believed it, but this is a pretty good study. And this is a really interesting paper, by the way. I wish I could have shown more slides from that paper, but I don't have time. So is there an insect apocalypse? Maybe not. Maybe there is in certain areas, but certainly many insect species are declining on multiple continents. So in order to get at this, in 2019, the Entomological Society of America convened a big symposium. They had 12 of the best ornithologists in the world come together and give papers. All the papers were collected and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And then there was an overview paper called The Anthropocene, in other words, the Era of Man, and the Death by 1,000 Cuts. So that's a summary of it, and I'm going to show you a slide or two from there. And so they said, basically what they said, though, about these broad-scale insect collapses, these studies, they suffer from unjustifiable assumptions. Well, who'd ever thought that? Or analytical issues. Wow, I'm amazed. Or, most importantly, the tendency to over-extrapolate. I can't believe it. So anyway, these studies, which are alarming, are not necessarily conclusive, according to the Entomological Society of America in this symposium. And some of the problems with assessing insects and saying what's happening is that we only know about 1 million insect species, and we believe there's about 4 to 6 million out there. So we don't only know a small fraction of the total number of insect species, which makes definitive statements a little harder. There is much natural variation in space and time and taxonomic lineage in many insect populations, and many decline and decrease periodically for a variety of known reasons. And sometimes those aren't taken into account in these studies. And so general statements such as insect apocalypse should probably be viewed with some caution. And that makes sense. Not all insect species are declining. Some are increasing. Some are merely experiencing historic but normal fluctuations in population. So details matter. So we don't know exactly what's going on, but the theory that they present in the paper, which I think is the best take-home message for us all, insects are no different than all other living things. They're being destroyed by human beings. All of these things that people are doing, fire, and then some of these natural things, storm intensity, global warming, droughts, agriculture, deforestation, agricultural intensification, getting more gallons of milk per cow, getting more bushels of soybeans per acre. And of course, that it means applying fertilizers. There's foreign species being introduced all the time that outcompete ours. Urbanization, pollution, death by 1,000 cuts. What's happening to insects is no different than what's happening to anything else. And I suspect that something is going on with insects. I suspect it's not good. But it probably varies with the geography. So it's going to be difficult for us to get a handle on what's going on. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But I think this is probably one of the sources of our problem, perhaps. And I'm not going to go over this slide. This just shows you some of the human activities that are thought to be most responsible for insect declines. I'm not going to take the time to talk about it. I will mention this slide right here. If I could just get this thing to behave itself. Oh, come on. Oh, gee. Here we go. Okay, so this is a study that came out in just 2020. It's by Michael Moran. He's not the first author, but he's the lead professor from Hewitt College, I think, down there in Arkansas. I might not be saying that name right. I hope I'm not. They said, here, look there's a ton of data out there. They said, let's go to the long-term LTR sites, the long-term ecological research sites. There were 68 of these set up in the 1980s, And they're big tracts of land that the federal government bought of various kinds of land and put aside to remain in pristine state so that ecologists could go there and do studies to say what things used to look like in the given environment. In other words, given today's weather and keeping the keeping the landscape the way it was in the 80s, what's going on. These are all the sites. Now you see circles and squares and dots, and don't worry about that. These are just the sites. There's 65 of them. It turns out there's 5,000 insect surveys on those sites, and they went and analyzed them all over time from 1984 to 2018. And they didn't find, and they said the following: no evidence of wholesale decline of abundance or diversity of arthropod or insect populations in North America. Okay, so no problem, right? Okay, but then I read the paper and I said, okay, well, from an ecologist's point of view, you know, some ecologist at a university is not necessarily looking at insects like a bluebird. Okay, insect ecologists are looking at assemblages, ecological measures of assemblages. So here's a place in one of the western states, I think Utah or Nevada, the Sialia. I should know where the Sialia is. I've been there, but I'm blocking out on it right now. Anyway, that's one of the long-term ecological research sites. They looked at the grasshoppers. And they did one of these typical ecological studies where you plot abundance versus species rank, and you get this curve. Well, the ecology theorem says if the shape of this curve is the same, the assemblage is equally strong if the curves are the same. So the assemblages are the same. Okay, so no problem, right? But look at this. Here are the actual species available at those two time periods. For example, there's about 30 or 40 species, 30 probably, species of grasshoppers in that prairie assemblage in 2000, in this period, in this year, 92 to 93. And these are the species. And then there's about 30 in 2012 to 2013, but look at this species. It's a dominant species in the first period. It's a minor species in the second. This species is a dominant species in the later time period, is a minor species. So if you are a bluebird and you prefer one of these, it could be with anything, not just grasshoppers. I'm just making a point here. If you're a bluebird and you prefer this species, when you get to this time period, you're not going to be as happy with that habitat when that grasshopper becomes a much smaller part of the assemblage. So I'm not sure that bluebirds see things the same way ecologists does. The good part is I've had a conversation with Dr. Moran and some email exchanges, and I think we're going to do a NAB seminar this summer, if we can get it set up, or this fall, and he'll come and talk about this study, and we'll get a chance to quiz him. He probably knows more about insects in North America than anybody that I know, so maybe we'll get a chance to quiz him about insects and birds. So I'm just going to end it with this. Okay, so we don't know what's going on, but we know something's going on. Those of us who have been around long enough, and that's most of us, we knew when we drove out in the country 30 or 40 years ago, this is what our windshield looked like. So we all did the windshield test, and we know it doesn't look like this anymore. So something's going on. We don't know what, but we know it's not good. So I do think insects are part of our problem. It's a long way of saying I don't know. Okay, so what about habitat? Well, here I'm going to go a little more quickly because I want to get to the end. Habitat is the same thing. We know that habitat's important. Are we experiencing widespread habitat loss? So, first of all, what the heck is bluebird habitat? Are any of these descriptors something you've ever used to describe bluebird habitat? Open fields with scattered trees, farmlands, grasslands, and pastures, forest edges and clearings created by fire and logging, sparsely inhabited residential areas, etc., etc., etc. We've used all of these. None of these, though, these are all descriptions of bluebird habitat that might fit one time or another. None of them are habitat at all, though, if they don't have cavities. So you can't just talk about the landscape. You need to have an appreciation for what's going on in terms of the cavities. Are there natural cavities or the man-made cavities there? If they're not, then it's not bluebird habitat. So that makes the analysis much more complicated, in my opinion. And of course, there's always a thing that habitat needs to be maintained. If you have a low-cut grass and like I did, a nice trail with 40 boxes, and then the county decides to not mow it, to go from mowing it 3 times a year to once a year, you find by June your habitat is, shoulder high grass, and you have tree swallow habitat. So that's all makes it complicated. Those detective shows where they used to put these notes up on a wall and they were trying to track down what happened in this crime. I thought it'd be interesting to put habitat and cavities up here on this little thing and kind of make this our crime scene here. Well, so 250,000 years ago, that's when the Eastern and the Western Bluebird split off from the Sialia prototype. In those days, the Eastern Bluebird was probably a very rare bird, found at forest edges and clearings by fires and windfalls. And maybe 30,000 years ago is the first humans appeared, and they started maybe burning forests or cutting down trees to some extent, small extent. Maybe bluebirds were doing better, but it was the arrival of the Europeans, the 1500s to 1800s, where we cleared the primary forest cover and grasslands opened up, that the bluebird became the common country bird, one of the most common. But even as we were opening the landscape up for them, we were taking it away because grassland was being converted to cropland and urban development. So this good news story rapidly started changing, and by 1940s and 1950s, it was a bad luck story for the bluebird. And of course, we did another dirty deed by bringing these birds in the mid to late 1800s. But again, another final blow, I think, for terms of agriculture was the mechanization and row cropping and the bigger equipment, which allowed farmers to farm right out to the edges, and so a lot of the hedgerows and fence lines and things like that disappeared. A lot of pasture land disappeared. So we started seeing declines. We were seeing declines in this period of the Eastern Bluebird over its range. And it reached probably a low point in the 40s, perhaps. Well, or maybe in the 30s. I don't know exactly when it reached the low point. I wasn't there. I was born in 44. But Musselman and Van Oort and Duncan and others started putting out nest boxes, describing this process that couldn't possibly do any good, but it did. And so by 1970, we had NABs and the other bluebird societies like yours, and we started to see the recovery of the bluebird. Well, and then we had the conservation reserve program, and so people look at conservation reserve and say, well, that's a lot of increase in grassland habitat, except that there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. The Farm Services Agency, which administers this program for the Department of Agriculture, says that you can't have structures on conservation reserve, and what they mean by that is a farmer can't build a granary or a feedlot on his conservation reserve property. But the Farm Services Agency started to call nest box structures. We've written some letters from NABs to them, and maybe this year they're finally considering one of our letters, and maybe they'll get rid of that provision. I'm sure there's lots of nest boxes on conservation reserve. I'm just saying that the Farm Services Agency says there shouldn't be. So let's drop that one now and say that we think habitat's involved, but again, it's very difficult and there's a lot of factors to look at. But here's one. What about bluebirders? What do we know about the number of bluebirders today in North America compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago? None of us are getting any younger. So I've reached about the 1 hour point on the talk. And so I've only got a few more minutes and then we'll go questions. So don't worry. I'm not going to leave you hanging here for another half hour with presentations. So what do we know about, the numbers of bluebirders? I don't think we know much at all. We know that we're having trouble keeping our ranks up. We're having trouble in NABs. I know you're having trouble here. Indiana Bluebird Society just turned in their chips. They abandoned 4 or 5 months ago. We got a letter saying that they just couldn't make a go of it. They didn't have enough people. They didn't have any young people that were getting involved that wanted to do the work. And that's happening with all of our societies. It's probably happening with bluebirders in general. What is the percentage of bluebirders today that belong to NABS or one of the affiliates like East Central Illinois? Is it 5%? Maybe it's less than 1%. So that brings the question as to what percentage of bluebirders are using proper nest boxes, safe mounts, monitoring, predator controls. Maybe that's not a very good situation right now. So we had a guy by the name of Glenn Havanagard and his assistant come to the NABS convention in 2016 up in Alberta. He interviewed everybody there. I think there was about 200 of us there. And he wrote a paper a couple years later, and he found out what we already know. We're older, we're more educated, we spend a lot of money on our trails, we invest in expanding our trails, we hope to carry on our trails for as long as we can. The number they got was 15 years, people hope for. I hope to be alive in 15 years. I don't know if I'll be doing my trail. But here's the thing, few had plans or persons in mind to take over their trail when they retired. And how long has that been true? And I'll just finish that with this. So we have, I wish we could get some handle on reproduction. You have a handle on reproduction. You're doing a survey here of your members. But as I used to do that same thing for the Ohio Bluebird Society, and it's fraught with a lot of errors because the same people don't report every year. And sometimes, and so that makes a problem. But if we could get, if we had we know how many bluebirds are here in the spring because we have the breeding bird survey. We know how many bluebirds are here in the winter because we have the CBC and eBird. If we only had some estimate of the number of fledglings continental wide every year, we'd have three pieces we could put together, and we might have some idea where the problem is occurring. Is it occurring here, here, or here? Okay. So if we could get more data to NestWatch, another plug for NestWatch, I'm sure that NestWatch could develop us a continental model to assess bluebird reproductive success on a continental scale. That would be a big step forward. So that's one suggestion I have. We're not going to go into this. I was going to talk a little bit about house sparrows. I'll do it real quick. Like, we know these have been around forever. We don't think they're getting necessarily any worse. House sparrows, though, are not getting worse, but they're still around, and they're definitely a regional thing. When I was here at your place about 5 years ago, I talked about house sparrows. You can see house sparrows are, oh, goodness gracious. Let me see if I can't get it to go this way. Here we go. Oh my goodness. Sorry, folks. Really having some trouble here. One of these arrows should get me where I want to be. All right. So house sparrows are found on 73% of the breeding bird survey routes. Isn't that nice? They're distributed all across the continent, but they are splotchy. The concentrations are highest here in the Midwest, up here in Alberta, and the concentrations are lowest down here in the Southeast. But you see, they're not evenly distributed. On the other hand, the numbers of bluebirds have been dropping about 3.5% per year since 1966. Right now, we think there's 100 to 100 million bluebirds in North America. There were perhaps 500 million at the turn of the century, 1919 or 1900. And here's, just quickly, here's house sparrows and bluebirds on the same scale. So you can see back in 1966, the index ratio of bluebirds to house sparrows was 60. Now, 52 years later, something like that, it's 4. So things have improved dramatically. House sparrows are decreasing at a much more rapid rate than bluebirds, and maybe in 50 years, house sparrows won't be a problem. I think there's still a problem in some areas. If you look at the ratio of house sparrows to bluebirds, here's this whole area in the Southeast where there's maybe only 1 to 5 house sparrows per bluebird. But places like Illinois, there's maybe 100 to 1,000 house sparrows per bluebird. Ohio, 50 to 100. So I'm not so sure that house sparrows aren't still part of the problem. I'm not saying they're the reason we're experiencing the problem, but they're still part of the problem. And this is why I like to make my own maps. This is my calculation of the high density areas for house sparrows. And you can see Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Iowa and Wisconsin are highest concentrations. Here's that Alberta and this one down here in New Mexico. I don't know what that's all about. But I can do the same thing for bluebirds. Here are the high concentration areas for bluebirds, and then I can put them on the same map. And so the brown areas are the high concentrations of house sparrows, and the blue areas are the high concentrations of bluebirds. Well, I don't think it takes a genius to see bluebirds are doing best where house sparrows aren't. So I'm going to say that house sparrows may be part of the reason for the trouble we're having raising bluebirds, especially in these areas in the Midwest where we're having the most trouble right now. For sure, they're not helping us. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen. There. And now we're back. Thank you. And now, does anybody have any questions? I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure that I've moved the ball very far ahead on the reasons, but for sure, we're having a lot of trouble right now raising the Eastern Bluebird. I can't say when you think about it in perspective, I can't say I'm surprised. There is no living thing that's doing very well that has to share the planet with Earth or with humans. So it's just a matter of time. We were able to, I think, put off the effects of human encroachment and monopolization of the resources for longer for the bluebirds than other birds because we were helping them. But I think it's possible we have reached a point where we are going to be less able to help them unless we can vastly increase our effort and put out a lot more nest boxes and a lot more person hours out there raising bluebirds, or and I think the trends are going the opposite direction on that. So we've got a fairly difficult problem in front of us. The good thing about it is that bluebirds, it looks to me like, are not in danger of extinction. They would probably be in danger of some kind of extirpation. In other words, they would probably continue to do well in the southeastern states. We would see the problem keep growing in the Midwest, growing, and I don't know what's going to happen in the northern areas. If it keeps getting warmer in the northern areas, bluebirds will want to go there, but there may not be any bluebirds to go there because it's, so I'm not sure if that'll turn around or not, but we're seeing the trends that we're seeing right now are not optimistic. As they say in politics, it gives me no pleasure to tell you that. Is somebody speaking? If anyone is speaking, you have to make sure your microphone is on.
I just said thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, I think results could look better, but we are doing better with the bluebird than a lot of other birds are doing. The sparrows, the native sparrows are being absolutely decimated. The native warblers are being decimated. The native blackbirds, which includes, the meadowlarks and birds like that, what's the bird I want? The orioles. They're crashing big time. And so we're certainly doing better with our bluebirds than they're doing. But it's a tough situation right now. I don't know if it would be possible to actually provide cover for bluebirds. I think it would be hard to do, but if you were a person who had some area where you had a large number of bluebirds that wintered each year, if I had property like that, I might be tempted to build a large brood box and heat it with a little solar heater, not to warm it up, but just to keep it from getting icy cold in there. And who knows how fancy you could make it. Maybe it wouldn't have to be very fancy, but you might be able to tide bluebirds over. You would probably have to provide some way of providing them with food and water, because a lot of times on those things, if you get the cold weather, then you get the ice or snow cover, and of course they starve to death if they don't freeze to death. So it's not a simple problem to solve. I hope this summer I'll be able to provide the data from the breeding bird survey. That data, they're going to release data up until I believe 2022. So we'll have the data from 2016 to 2022. That came about, I guess, as a result of the COVID thing. They didn't go out in 2020, so they had a chance to reorganize and during that time, and were able to get things lined up so that they're going to be able to give us the data in the next year or so, or maybe in the next few months, instead of having to wait till 2027 to get the 2015 to 2025 data. So that's a good step forward. Yes.
I live on a farm, and I also oversee about 40 volunteers in Vermilion County who do nest box monitoring anywhere from farms to homes to golf courses and the conservation district areas. And so one thing that I seem to notice is that around the farming areas where we're feeding cattle, or where there's that more of a habitat and there are barns and things, we're more likely to have more problems with the house sparrows.
Yep.
Than in some of these other areas, say the golf courses and other places. So that's just a little observation that I've seen in terms of house sparrows, which they are a problem. I also notice with the house sparrows that they seem much more, for me anyway, they seem to be very aggressive now. You know, they're the first ones who want to start nesting. They get in the boxes. They will be more aggressive. And if I can keep working at it, not always, but often they will eventually be more discouraged. And then later on, the tree swallows or then the bluebirds can come in.
Yeah.
Once in a while, they do get back in there and they will destroy a nest, and I'll lose some. But those are some of the observations I've seen with the house sparrows. And then another comment I wanted to make is talking about needing more monitors. Through the extension program here in this area, we have the Master Naturalist program. Have you heard of that?
I've heard of those, yeah.
And so it's a wonderful program that that demographic of people that you mentioned really enjoy. We have a lot of retired people who seem to enjoy this excellent program that gives people a lot of information about nature and wildlife and all those things associated with it. And then once they finish this program, they have to give back, I think it's some of you may already be master naturalists, but I think it's like 60 hours of service. And they're looking for projects. They're looking for things that they can do. And the nest box monitoring is one of the projects that they can do.
Yeah.
And I have found in looking for volunteers for all the trails over here in Vermilion County, I've found it's an excellent match. These are people who have the time and the interest, and they're generally people who are committed. And it's been a great fit in terms of finding people to take over some of these trails where people are aging out and for one reason or another. So that has become a great resource of really great people who are well qualified and really enthusiastic. And oftentimes they will last longer than their hours, and they find that they really enjoy it and they'll stay with it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, I've often thought that that rural, rural bluebirds are going to live or die on based on what happens in rural America. They're the people that have the habitat, and they're kind of attached to the land anyway, and they're inclined to do those kinds of things. And I've often thought that the way to reach rural people is through that extension service, and in 4-H and FHA, those are the programs that mean something to them. But I don't know that we've ever effectively figured out a way, to be ambassadors to 4-H, or and I wondered if is there a national organization of farm extensions? All the extension organizations of every state belong to a national organization where they have a convention every year. We could go there and make a presentation on bluebirds, and get these extension services going. Maybe that's something I'll work on now. I've got a little bit more time on my hands to do other things.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The best network of farming people or landowners is the Farm Service Agency, Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And they were going to try to get rid of those a few years ago. And fortunately, that didn't happen, at least in Illinois. And it is truly the best network to reach landowners. And you're reaching both local landowners and people who are absentee land owners as well, who I find generally trend to be very conservation minded, and are often people who they may not live here, but they're tenant farmer or whoever. They are people who might be interested. And so maybe, I know there are state and federal programs and they each have their own ideas about things, but, incorporating this into, becomes sort of the carrot kind of thing, but there are incentives for people to set aside properties that do things. But it is a great resource, probably the best resource, in my opinion, of networking with landowners.
Yeah, rural people trust that organization, those organizations. They trust the extension agent.
Yeah, so maybe trying to get extension to network with the FSA office in terms of promoting these kinds of programs could be helpful. Because I think there are a lot of people out there that really are interested, but like you say, it's finding them and connecting with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are things we can do if we could just pull it off. If we could, I think we could probably rejuvenate the movement. If we could just find the right place to present and the right people to reach and talk to.
It's going to happen on social media if you want to reach the young people. And we're struggling with that in our Middle Fork Audubon group here. And, a lot of the conversations that are really reaching a lot of the younger people are happening through Facebook and Twitter and these kinds of places. And finding, maybe hiring someone who can help model that and present that. That's where TikTok, these are the places where they're really having these conversations.
Yeah. Stan, you were at the NABS board meeting, weren't you, yesterday?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I didn't Dana say that we now had, was it 40,000 likes or 20,000 likes on our Facebook page?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, I was really surprised.
So it really is.
A lot of interest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thanks.
I'm struck by the again, I know it's anecdotal, but when I was a kid, you had every 20 minutes or so driving around in the summer, you had to stop and wipe your windshield off because of all the insects. You never do that nowadays. I think it's the insect food that is the real culprit here, and it drives bluebirds and sparrows. It's all the small birds that rely on these insects.
Yep.
We have a garden and we have corn and cabbage and beans. I don't soak it with insecticides, but I have to every once in a while. I have to deal with a cabbage worm or a worm in the corn. You just cut it off. Nowadays, people won't tolerate that. The populace wants things perfect. To do that, the farmers have to just soak their fields with insecticides.
Yeah.
And I think it's a shame. I think society's got to be able to understand that you can't you just accept less than perfect.
Yeah.
You have to accept less than perfect in order to avoid just totally decimating the
Yeah.
insect population.
Yeah.
If I go to a farm market and I'm looking at the sweet corn, if I see a bug in one, man, I'm buying a dozen of those ears because that farm doesn't overuse the insecticides. Really,
A good idea.
people got to get that idea in their mind.
That's good. That's a good point. Yeah, get more of them if you see a bug in there.
Yes, absolutely. They're not toxic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's a mindset that it's going to have to. I think it's going to have to happen. That Doug told me. I don't know if you, Doug, I think you've heard his discussion that
I've
people
heard of it a lot.
buy these trees that there are no bugs in because
Mhm.
there's not a problem. They're perfect. They don't have to spray them or trim them, but they don't encourage any insects that birds can eat.
Are they self-pollinating or something? Something.
No, like Zelkova,
Oh,
they have zero insects that populate the Zelkova tree. They don't have holes in their leaves. They don't have problems. Whereas the oak tree has hundreds of different species of insects and caterpillars. Now they get holes and they get insects eating the branches and things, but they feed lots and lots of birds. It's a whole different mindset. Perfection is not something that the society needs at the expense of our birds.
yeah. There was one person made a comment on the notes. It said, if you made a larger wintering box, would you leave the opening? I think it must be the same as a single box with a slot. I think that's what the question was. Yeah, you'd probably have to look into that a little bit as to what you would do. I would guess, yeah.
That's very interesting. Somebody, actually, Ann Stern, like Ann, she gave me a nest box, a winter nest box, which had a roost box, which had an opening in the bottom and some pegs in the middle that the birds could climb up and sit on.
Yep.
That's seems to me that's a human's idea of what they should be doing.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think you just need to have open boxes, and I think a large one is a good idea because they tend to group together. I've seen pictures of lots of bluebirds together and on a cold night.
Yeah. Yeah, these days too, it would be relatively easy to fix up a little bit of ancillary heat, I mean, you've got all kinds of little solar cells and heaters, you could,
Sure.
if you could, if it was minus 30 outside, but it was only 0 in your box, that would make all the difference in the world, and out of the wind, So, yeah.
I would suggest just wrapping some insulation around the outside of some of your boxes where you've had birds nesting.
Yeah, you could do that too. Winterize it. We always used to say winterize. I always used to end my column with winter. Be sure and winterize your box in the fall. And but even that, when you have these really bad winter storms, I mean the birds, if they don't freeze to death, they die from starvation or lack of water. So there's no water. It's pretty tough. Well, very good. What I will do is I will get sometime this week, I'll get a video from Zoom of this presentation, and then I will just clip off the beginning where I'm sitting around waiting for people and then leave this discussion on there and then just upload it on YouTube, and then anybody that wants to look at it can look at it. So
thank you again, Bernie, and very enlightening.
Well, good. I'm glad I had a chance to give this talk. I was supposed to come up to Eastern Illinois, East Central Illinois, but to Paris. But I messed up my neck and I couldn't even turn my head, so I didn't really feel
Oh.
like trying to drive. I'm back okay again now. I finally broke down and went to see a chiropractor after the pain went away, you know. I didn't want him twisting around on me when it was in pain. But so I'm close to back to normal now. But
Great.
I wasn't that day. So anyway, I hope you had a good conference.
We did. Glad you're
Good.
feeling better. Thank you for your
Okay.
input tonight. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks
Hi,
again.
thank you.
Bye.
Enjoy your bluebirds. Stay